Bet the Board presents Stay Green. Stay Green is your first stop for all the metrics, matchups, and money-making opportunities at the track each race week. This is Stay Green, the NASCAR betting podcast. Here are your hosts, Todd Fuhrman and racing analyst Chris Werme.
Welcome into the Stay Green podcast, part of the Wondery Network, a Bet the Board podcast production. From the 2-mile oval at Michigan, where we saw high speeds in a race that spanned about 20 hours, we go to right turns and left turns, staying in the Midwest at Indianapolis Road Course. I am your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by professional NASCAR bettor and racing enthusiast Chris Werme.
Whoa.
Right out of the gates, buddy. I had to think about who I was doing the show with because I'm in full football mode with pain. How are you, buddy?
I'm good. How are you? Happy to have what was a pretty good weekend kind of behind us. We were able to hopefully, I know there are a few people that reached out to us and said, "Hey, I bet Busher based on the podcast." So that was good to hear that. Unfortunately, to go 0-2 in the best bets in like not even get a chance to watch more than 12 laps on pretty much all of them was
you and I were texting through the early portion of the race on Sunday and went, here we go again, because we had outright exposure to a number of drivers that didn't quite make it into the day 2 of racing by any stretch of the imagination. Then you watch Chris Bell really pick things up at one of the fastest cars on track. But unfortunately, like you said, the best bet we gave out on the show did not get home for us, nor did what we identified on race day as Chase Elliott, had intentions of making sure his day could end early. But like always in this business, we power forward and we'll look to be better this weekend. For those folks tuning into the Stay Green podcast for the first time, we break this up into 3 distinct stages, but we are throwing a little bit of a curveball into the mix. Normally, stage 1 is all about what we learned last week and what we can use going forward. Chris and I decided that what we learned at Michigan is absolutely irrelevant for the next 3 races in the regular season. So rather than reliving all of that, we'll put it in the rear view mirror. Stage 1 will be about some of the interlopers and long shots. Stage 2 will still cover the betting basics. And stage 3, a race weekend breakdown where we'll focus on a lot of the familiar names. So Chris, when we get into the race this weekend, and for those folks that are looking up and down the odds board, they see some unfamiliar names if they're diehard NASCAR fans. But if they're fans of motorsport in general, some of these names are a little bit more familiar than they will be otherwise. You have an F1 world champion. You have 2 Le Mans 24 winners in there. You have a 3-time Supercars champion, the current Supercars point leader, also on the track. 7 countries spanning 4 continents will be represented in NASCAR's highest series, and it's not often we get to see star drivers from such diverse backgrounds. And we'll get into some of those specifics in a second, but want to lay out some of the track specs first for the Verizon 200 at the Brickyard. I think that's what they're still calling it.
Yep.
Third time we'll see the Indy Road Course, 82 laps around the 2.4-mile Indianapolis Road Course. We do get a little bit IndyCar appetizer on Saturday. And the course will feature 14 turns and a hard right turn out of the illustrious Calamity Corner in turn 1. But thankfully, Chris, NASCAR came to their senses, and we have changed the restart zone this year.
That makes it bettable. To be honest, I went back and watched like some of my notes, or looked at my notes from last week or last year, and it basically said, do not bet this fucking track, was exactly what, like, do not bet this, just because of the shit show that ensued, the last, 4 restarts or whatever, where it was just dive bob into one. There's a lot of people have brought up, well, there's the same kind of thing at Watkins Glen, but there's at least a runoff area in Watkins Glen. Here, it's like, hey, you need to turn right. You need to do it right now. And if not, there's severe consequences. So I think it was smart. It'll be interesting because like they're basically restarting before the front stretch, before they turn on the front stretch at Indianapolis Motor Speedway. It should stretch out a little bit, but now they're going to be very clumped together and going much faster. So it won't be the same as like, a restart 500 yards before the turn. It's going to be like, hey, we're now all going full speed, like 180 miles an hour, and then we're all going to have to turn. Now it'll be spaced out a little bit more, but the braking zones might be a little bit different from typical restarts. It'll be more like the braking zones from a race. So we'll see how they, if they're able to kind of adapt and see if there's anybody that's just better at the restarts because of the new restart zone. That'll be interesting to see.
And a friendly reminder for those folks out there as we go into our 4th road course of the season, we will have stages. We will not have stage breaks. So this race will run depending on where the caution flags come, and those will be the only guaranteed yellows we see out there. So strategy can play a role. More on that a little bit later in the show. As far as track comps are concerned, I have to ask you the overarching question. I feel I do this rinse and repeat anytime we go to road courses. Are all road courses for you created equally when you look at the handicapping?
No, I think that there's very distinct differences, in all of them. I would say if two were the most similar, I would definitely say COTA and then this week at Indy. I think that they race very similarly. I know even though it's a Roval, I feel like the Charlotte Roval is just a kind of a different animal altogether. And Sonoma races, it's way more technical, way more tire wear. And I just feel like the setups for the cars at COTA will transfer over a lot of the speed. Hopefully a lot of the speed that we saw there will transfer over this week. So about 80% of COTA and 10% Sonoma and 10% last year's race, because you have to factor in guys are in different cars and teams have made gains. Like you're not going to see Truex at 30-1 or 40-1 like he was last year. So you can't use too much from last year, but I think just to get a basic idea of the flow of the race and the different strategies involved in order to kind of make predictions for this week.
And for those scoring at home, when you look at what manufacturers have performed better at road courses, Chevy has really dominated, scoring 16 wins over the course of the last 20 races on road courses. And when you look at the breakdown this year, Chevy led 29 of 75 laps at COTA, 25 of the 110 in Sonoma, and 32 of 78 in Chicago. We'll mention the street course just for argument's sake. By comparison, it was Toyota leading 42 of the 75 laps at COTA, 84 of the 110 at Sonoma, largely because of the 19 car that you mentioned in Martin Truex Jr. and 46 of the 78 laps that we saw in Chicago in the rain. When we look at some of the unfamiliar names, we can call them road course ringers, we can call them the interlopers. I think we have to start with the man that won at Chicago, becoming the first-time debutante winner in NASCAR in an absolute eternity. It was 60 years since we'd seen a driver win in his Cup Series debut, and he drove from 18th to 1st in the inaugural running of that Chicago street course. That, of course, being Shane Van Gisbergen, going off at 12-1. And when you look at his weekend, he's going to be a busy man. He's racing the trucks on the oval at IRP leading up into it. We're not going to break that down, but buyer beware there. He could find that to be a rude awakening, to say the least. But I did find it interesting, a quote from him: "This whole NASCAR experience has been a dream come true ahead of his second Cup start. I can't wait to get to America, then Indy. It will certainly be different than the Chicago street course. I'll need to get up to speed quickly, but we plan a lot of simulator time, and I know crew chief Darian Grubb will be thoroughly prepared to get me ready for Indy." When you look at Shane, this is obviously buying a stock at the top of the market. How do we handicap the talented driver from down under?
Because, I guess I didn't really talk about, I threw the Chicago street course completely away. I thought that was just due to the rain and the style of racing, just street racing, along with, having walls and barriers all around the track, really doesn't fit a typical NASCAR road course. So I've completely thrown that away, with the exception of one thing. SVG is talented. So, he was given a great opportunity to win, but he had to go out there and pass some fast race cars and do it late and then keep a lead. So that being said, we've seen him, he kind of opened at 20, and I think everyone has, him circled, and he's kind of worked his way down to this 12-1. I could understand a pre-week or a pre-practice and qualifying bet at 20, but 12-1 is really short. You're pricing him ahead of, guys like Michael McDowell, Chris Buescher, AJ Allmendinger, that I would consider super, super solid drivers on road courses and super versatile. Whereas we just haven't seen him in enough tracks where, remember, NASCAR drivers had never run at Chicago. So he was coming in and seeing the course for the first time, as were these NASCAR drivers. This week's going to be a little bit different. NASCAR drivers had a couple swings at this track. They know some of the directions that the track changes will head and some of the adjustments that'll need to be made. And I think that it is going to be hard for him to follow it up with just say another top 5 run. I'm not saying it can't happen, but I think this week will be a little harder for him.
A native of Perth, Australia, Brody Kostecki will join the field as well. His price anywhere from 20 to 1 upwards of 25. He currently leads the Supercars Championship and has some experience driving stock cars in the States. Actually ran 16 ARCA East races between 2013 and 2014. 2 victories and 10 podium finishes in 12 races in the supercar circuit this season between Australia and New Zealand. He'll be driving the 33 of RCR, and keep in mind, obviously, it was the RCR 8 car of Tyler Reddick that absolutely dominated this field last year. And his quote leading up to it, "It's an honor to compete at such an iconic venue and against some of the biggest names in motorsport. Racing is at the core of everything I do, and NASCAR has been a lifelong goal of mine after spending years growing up in the sports heartland in North Carolina." When you look at Brody's number of interest, or clearly odds makers protecting themselves from some of the unknown?
Yeah, overvalued in my opinion. Of all the ringers, I think that this is where the driver that's most overvalued, and I don't blame books for pricing him there. I think they're just not interested in taking any action on them, which after SVG coming in and winning his first race and coming kind of from the same series, I think that it's important to maybe protect yourself a little bit. However, there's going to be a difference. I think that Trackhouse has been a little bit faster. Well, let's just throw that away. I'm going to say this. I think that RCR on road courses has not been as fast as some of the other manufacturers. And, if you look at, the Toyotas especially, I think that there's more value in someone we're going to talk about here in a second. But I don't know. I think to just be 20 to 1 or 25 to 1 in your first race just because SVG came in and was successful does not necessarily mean that Brody's going to come in and find success. I know that he has driven some ARCA cars. I think that'll be important, but the 33 RCR car is not going to be the same as the Project 91 or the 67 car in Kamui.
Well, you mentioned the 67, and you have to be careful what you say about a driver making his debut in a car, because when you look at Kamui Kobayashi, his number was 100 to 1 earlier in the week, but we've seen that price get absolutely buried across the board, as low as 30 to 1. So do shop around if this driver is going to make your portfolio this weekend. He's a 36-year-old sports car ace and former F1 driver, making his NASCAR Cup debut this weekend, driving the aforementioned 67 for 23XI Racing. Becomes the first Japanese driver to start a Cup race since Hideo Fukuyama over 20 years ago at Sonoma. That was before I handicapped NASCAR. I'm not sure if you were heavily entrenched in the space back then. He won the overall as part of a group at Le Mans back in 2021. The 67 was out there at Daytona for 23XI, driven by Travis Pastrana, but they bring this car back to the mix. Expectations for the talented member driving for Toyota this weekend?
Well, if it was the Toyotas from last year, I would say he didn't have a chance in hell. However, the Toyotas have found a lot of speed, and especially in road courses. When you look at, especially at Coda, where Tyler Reddick, I thought was far and away the best car. And then he did the same thing at Sonoma, or the Toyotas did the same thing in Sonoma with Martin Truex Jr. So I think that Kobayashi's coming in with kind of the best equipment heading into this race. So I find it interesting. I know that he doesn't have the same experience driving stock cars as the other two drivers in SVG and Brody, but man, speed cures a lot of ills. And if you can go up there and lay down a lap and kind of start up front, I think that, there'll be a quick learning curve for him, but rumor has it that he was super fast on the simulator. And I think if there's a particular style of track where the simulator does really translate, we've seen it with Tyler Reddick, and it's these road courses, because Tyler Reddick struggled for a long time in these road courses. And when Denny went up to him and said, "Hey, what are you doing to get so much faster at these road courses?" He said, "I hit the simulator." So if that can kind of transfer over to the race, I do think that Kobayashi could be there. We did nibble some of the 100 just because you don't need to get very much down to get paid out here. And, we didn't want to get SVG'd, where we had discussed it on the podcast before with Alan Kavana, and we didn't pull the trigger at 100. And the next thing you know, he opens 8 to 1 the next day, and we're just sitting there hoping he doesn't win. And we were wrong. So we didn't let that happen again this time.
2 drivers that are long shot prices. Don't need to spend a lot of time here because we have a number of guys that we want to get to on this fine program. Jenson Button, we've seen him before at 200 to 1. I mean, this is a guy that's going to be driving the 15 for Rick Ware Racing. And Mike Rockenfeller filling in for Legacy Motorsports in the 42. no reason to discuss Noah Gragson and his ongoing tenuous status with the team. We will leave the politics to get sorted out in that particular camp. Rockefeller has a relationship with Jimmy Johnson after racing with him in IMSA for 2 years and together in the Garage 56 program. These guys, for me, Worm, unless you feel otherwise, I feel are guys that are out there just to round out the field. I can't imagine either one of them is going to factor into the finish of this.
I think a guy like Jensen Button is probably hoping that he can get some more experience and then maybe end up in a faster ride in the future. He obviously has gotten a little bit better. And I think that's the biggest thing that I forgot to mention with Kobayashi is Jensen Button was talking about how hard it is to race with a bumper that's used. And, that's not used in F1 or open wheel racing. And I think it'll be really important for Kobayashi to kind of make that transition. But I think that's what Jensen Button's doing. I think he's coming out here. He's just trying to get some experience and maybe land himself a better ride in the future and then be competitive. But I don't think the 15 or the 42 for that matter are going to be competitive at all. They just don't have the same equipment that we're talking about with Trackhouse, 23XI, and RCR. So it's cool to see the sport growing with all these different drivers. I think that it kind of lends to a potential future of maybe racing outside the U.S., which I think would be awesome and would be a great little, business write-off or a business expense for someone that does this for a living. So, make sure it's a nice place that I'd like to go. But it'll be interesting to just see how everything pans out, and especially practice and qualifying. That'll tell us a lot about who's going to be in the game this weekend.
Before we get into stage 2 and stage 3, there are a couple drivers at prices. We'll call them 20-1 or greater that are familiar names within the Cup Series. And, you can obviously take as much time as you need to cover some of them, but I'll lay them out and I'll start at the highest odds to the lowest. Ross Chastain at 30-1, Chris Buescher 25-1. Shout out Chris Buescher for winning back-to-back races. Now is one of just 3 drivers to win back-to-back races since we've gone to the next gen car. Ironically enough, it happened last year. Kevin Harvick won the same back-to-back races, one at Richmond, one at Michigan, because we always know there's a lot of similarities between a high tire wear 3/4 mile oval and a 2-mile oval at Michigan where you run some of the fastest speeds. Yeah. Austin Cindric at 25-1, Michael McDowell at 25-1. Both those drivers have to win to get into the playoff, most likely. Denny Hamlin at 20, William Byron to 20. Obviously, we can talk about as many of these drivers as you like, or if there's one or two that you want to highlight more so than others, by all means, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I'm going to throw kind of just Trackhouse together. The last time that Trackhouse was fast was SVG at Chicago. So
Chastain had a little bit of speed last week. He wasn't a race-winning car, but he did have a little more speed than we've seen of late.
Yeah, it's crazy that he had a 7th place finish last week. He had a 7th place finish last week, and I know that we had him in a matchup over Logano, which was kind of a just an all day a better car. But just to think for us to compliment Ross Chastain and say, well, he had a good run last week and he finished 7th. I mean, that's how bad this team has been. So I would throw just Trackhouse in that mix and say they just haven't had the speed that we saw last year or even earlier this year. So now, can they catch a setup and both of those guys go out there and be competitive in this race? Absolutely. But I do think it's going to take kind of a miracle qualifying effort or something magical to happen in practice for them to see a huge reduction in price. I don't like either of those Trackhouse guys at this point. Now, if you want to get on to Chris Buescher, here's the thing with Buescher. I like him a lot in like these, top 5 and top 10s because he's really solid. But at a 25-1, he just hasn't gone out there and led a lot of laps on road courses. He's always been, playing, second or third fiddle to a better driver. And I do think he's really consistent and he's going to be great in matchups. But at 25-1, I'd rather just wait and see, because even if he'd have to put it in the top 3 in order for that price to drop. So I think right now it's just better to wait and see, because maybe they unload and they're looking for speed, which, I still think Buescher will have a good run, but you certainly don't want to have matchups on a guy that if he's feeling questionable about how his car unloaded and how it looked in qualifying. Austin Cindric is interesting because he was pretty good here last year. He's just kind of been lying around in the weeds. I know he was top 4 at COTA. He's a really talented road course race. He's from the Indy area. Oh, no, that's Briscoe that's from the Indy area. Is it Briscoe?
No, but Cindric is as well. And I mean, I think it's important when you talk about Cindric, who his father is as well. I mean, Tim Cindric is the Team Penske team president and calls the strategy for the Indianapolis 500. and did so for Joseph Newgarden's win. So obviously a little bit of family familiarity with this track, albeit the traditional running of the Brickyard a little bit different than the road course.
Yeah, he just practiced well last year here. I just remember that it was kind of the young kids. It was like that qualified well here last year. It was Briscoe, it was Cindric, it was Bell and Reddick. It was like children were leading the field to green last year. So I do think he'll be good. Obviously with the stage breaks, if you can kind of get up front and stay up without stage breaks, if you can get up front and kind of stay up front, Austin's a great qualifier. And he ran well when he was here in the 33 car. So I do anticipate him being strong this week. Now, is he going to have a race-winning car? I'm not sure. But I do think that this 25-1 price could come down a little bit with a good practice and good qualifying. When it comes to Michael McDowell, basically just everything I said about Chris Buescher. They're the same to me. You could just switch them up. They're both going to run between 4th and 8th. They're never going to have a chance at the win, in my opinion. And they're going to qualify probably anywhere from 8th to 12th, and never be a threat for the win, but be solid for matchups all day. And I think they'll be really consistent, especially Michael McDowell, who, if he doesn't have a chance to win the race, he better guarantee himself some points to stay in the mix and potentially make this playoffs. And then the final one, I guess I'll kind of group Byron and Hamlin together. I like one of them a lot more than the other. I think Byron was really good at COTA, arguably the second best car. And I do think that track will transfer over to some speed here this week. So I do think at that, 20 to 25-1, Byron might be worth a little bit of nibble. But I think Denny Hamlin, who has really kind of turned it on road courses this year, he's been running really fast week in and week out. He was very average at COTA, but really stepped it up at Sonoma, where he was really solid. Him and his teammate Truex were solid all day. And then he goes out there or he pulled it at Sonoma, and then he goes out there and pulls it in Chicago, and, kind of has a bonehead, slipping in the rain type incident, and never saw the front again. So I think that Denny Hamlin, he could go off at less than 10-1. I think if you're expecting the Toyotas to be good, you should get involved with Hamlin at this point in the week.
We'll officially wave the green, white checkered flag on stage 1, but much like the road course this weekend, there will be no breaking here. We'll continue to motor right through and encourage all of you, our loyal listeners, to follow Chris on Twitter. That's at Chris Werme15. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, as always, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And if you're getting ready for the National Football League season as well, all those division previews are starting to drop Monday and Thursday up until the season starts. You should be subscribed to the Bet the Board channel. Know the moment Stay Green goes live and a lot of the other great content that we put out on a weekly basis. Before we get to the drivers to watch, talk about the favorites and a lot of the guys that we think are going to end up on the podium this weekend, you had a question asked of you for the pre-race poll that you do every Sunday. You're great about sharing the time that you're going to do that, and it's a chance to digest some of the additional information and data points that you have. The practice times, looking at the odds after they've readjusted, so it's a different handicap than diving into this pre-week. And I can't remember the individual that asked, but it was all about, identifying the outright market, the exposure there, the props, the head-to-head matchups. And I think this race, as much as last weekend for a variety of different reasons, it always begs the question, there are multiple ways to be successful in this particular business, and every weekend at the track doesn't offer some of those same opportunities. So you being the adult in the room, if you could expound on how you go about trying to put everything together and put yourself in a position each and every weekend, other than the super speedway races that you've told us you don't bet and you don't even watch, to be able to maximize some of your profits betting NASCAR.
Yeah, I think that something that I said in the pre-race poll, which is the pre-race show I do on YouTube every week, I said something like, you need to have Chris Buescher on your card, because if he gets out front, it's so hard to pass. And that he had enough speed where it was going to be hard to make a pass and he could potentially win the race. And I think it's really important to recognize the style or type of racing that's going to go on, because the difference between Michigan versus like a Martinsville is handicapped very differently. A place like Michigan, where there's a lot of strategy involved and a lot of drafting, where if you go to make a move on a guy and you're not able to make the pass, you're going to lose 6 or 7 spots if it's within 3 or 4 laps of a restart. Like, you could find yourself racing for the lead And if you're not able to complete the pass, you're going to find yourself in 12th or 13th place. So I think it's really important to understand the style of racing where that wouldn't happen at Martinsville, where there's going to be a lot of tire fall off. So when there's races like Michigan, where I say, hey, I think if Chris Buescher gets the lead at 60-1, he could win the race. That means I probably think that about 10 or 12 other guys. And so whenever that's the case, I like to take a look at the outright market, because if I think that someone that's 30-1 can win, I want to have a little bit there. And I think that the last 2 weeks, and I'm also going to include this week in that, where if someone gets out front, they're going to be really, really hard to pass unless there's a rocket ship. Now, last week we had a rocket ship in Martin Truex Jr., but it was just so hard to pass, and Buescher was good enough. So whenever it's really hard to pass out front, and this has been often, I do like guys that I trust as great drivers. And so Michigan was as close to like a super speedway race that we've seen in a long time. And whenever that's the case, I'm less certain on guys that I think that can win. And I lower the amount bet per driver, and I bet more drivers. So it's, I don't want to say betting the lottery, but kind of like that. I'd rather have more guys at higher odds in a situation where anybody that gets out front could go out there and lead laps. I think the same thing this week. Now, that's just to start from an outright perspective. But then you find a place at like Darlington or Martinsville where there's tire fall off and these car setups matter so much. That's when I'm way more matchup heavy and less outright heavy, because usually when there's a place like Darlington and Martinsville, we know after practice and qualifying who the best car is. And those odds usually get blasted down. But you know what? You can still make a mistake. You can still have a loose wheel. And you need to kind of factor that into your risk profile when betting the outright market. So I find myself in more predictable races betting more matchups. And then in more unpredictable races where I feel like, cars are super aero sensitive and it's hard to make a pass, I like to bet more guys at longer odds. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I also think it goes without saying that even for Chris Buescher, for those folks that did have him as part of their betting equation last weekend, it wasn't just Chris Buescher winning the race with a fast car. It took a piss-poor pit stop from the 45 who beat him off a pit road by a decided margin. And if the 45 gets out front, it could be a very different storyline. Yep. Obviously, the 19 was knocking at the door, got loose under the 17, had a second crack or a second bite at the apple, and just wasn't able to try and get there. So you need so many things to go right to win these races. And ironically enough, we've seen Chris Buescher come home at relative long shot prices each of the last couple of weeks after we talked about how we'd seen a run of favorites and how efficient the market had been, the way odds makers had readjusted prices from practice into race day. So you have to be malleable with all this. You have to be fluid with the way that you're building your race cards and be able to maximize some of the opportunities that are there. But that only comes with experience. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add, that was just kind of like the opening part to kind of just the way I look at like a race card. The other part is there's going to be certain drivers that you want to make money on. And now this can come in two forms. This can come betting on or fading, right? There's certain guys like last week, I thought Kevin Harvick looked like he was going to struggle and Joey Logano looked like he was going to struggle. Now, sometimes Kevin Harvick just looks like he's going to struggle in practice and he runs really well. But Logano kind of does the same thing. However, I knew based on comments that Logano's car was not where it needed to be. And so I wanted to make money fading Logano. I was able to find someone in Ross Chastain, someone that I trusted, and I thought his car was good enough to where if he made a mistake and he had to restart the tail end, he would still be able to pass Logano. That's kind of right now my barometer for betting matchups is if the guy I'm betting on makes a mistake, which if you're betting on Chris Bell, it's happening often, can he recover? And I thought that Chastain was good enough. He had a good enough qualifying to where he'd have a decent pit stall that he could work his way back up through the field if Logano ever got by him. So, and then there's other times where, maybe you've missed an outright number on a driver and you don't like the price. Like, for example, it would be Loudon when you had both Chris Bell and Truex at like a 4.5-1. It's a pretty short number. They looked really good. And looking back, you could have taken Truex for everything at 4.5-1. But I was able to find, I wanted both of those guys on my card. But when we went to the top 5 markets, because those are pooled differently than The outright markets, I was able to get some Chris Bell at like a minus 130 for a top 5 when you had Martin Truex Jr. sitting at a minus 180. Now, I thought that those guys were very equal, but that's where I just took an opportunity to say, hey, this is the best price if I want to be involved with these drivers. I want to make money on Chris Bell being fast. Sometimes you just have to look at different markets, whether it's a top 5 or top 10 market, or maybe it's a matchup. There's other ways to make money off drivers, and doesn't necessarily have to be in the outright market, and it doesn't necessarily have to be you don't have to be betting on a driver to make money. You can also fade drivers that you think are going to struggle.
I mean, and we've talked about that a number of times on this very show about, look, if you can find a driver that the market doesn't realize is absolute trash, it can be more profitable betting against that driver, because if he has a rough day, you can beat him 3 times. Whereas if you're betting on a driver in 3 or 4 matchups and he has a rough day, you're immediately going 0-4. So it's a little bit of a different dynamic in play. And I think it's a thought process that takes a while to cultivate for those folks that have grown a lot more accustomed to betting stick and ball sports, where it's team A versus team B, instead of betting against team A 3 or 4 different times in any given weekend, like you're able to do in NASCAR. So a lot of stuff to factor in. As always, if you have questions, tweet them at Chris or myself using the hashtag #StayGreen. We'll try and do everything we can to incorporate them, especially as we inch closer to the postseason, and can make all of you guys and girls out there that are following along much smarter NASCAR bettors. Waving the green, white checkered flag on stage 2, and we will go right into stage 3, my friend. And when we look at stage 3, it's how we normally do things with the drivers to watch. You mentioned a couple of the favorites here. Martin Truex Jr., a price right around 5-1. Tyler Reddick in a very similar vicinity. And Chase Elliott, the forgotten man now that has to win to get in over the next 3 weeks, at a price right in that 8-1, 8.5-1 range. So we can start with that trio of favorites. And again, you are the maestro around these parts, so take us where we need to go. And if you leave information out, I'll be sure to call you out.
Sure. I think let's just start with Truex. He's been fast, newsflash, and he's good on road courses. So, this plus 450, I think if you shop it around, we've seen some places kind of raise his odds up to that 6-1 price. And I'll tell you what, 6-1 is pretty close to a buy for me. We were able to enter the market a little earlier, got a little bit better than 7 or a little better than 6 on Truex. And I don't think 6 is a terrible price, because I do think that if one of these two guys, this between Ruex, that is Ruex, which would be Reddick and Truex.
So apparently it's contagious. I can't get your name out of my mouth at the start of the show. I stumble on the introduction. You at least waited a legit half hour before you were going to stumble.
I think that we are going to see Ruex, which would be Reddick and Truex, qualify really well. And I think that we could see them kind of go off at that 4-1 price. So I think if between Truex and Reddick, if you think that there's one guy that has an edge, I would go ahead and take that 6-1 price on one of them, because I know that Tyler's sitting at 6-1 most places. I think they're going to be very similar. I would give a slight edge to Tyler Reddick. He's had more success on tracks like this, which would be like Coda, and then obviously last year at this race. But remember, different equipment from last year's race. Kyle Busch will be driving that 8 car. It's hard to tell who's going to be better. If you look at current form, do you give the edge to Martin Truex Jr.? Yeah, but also let's look at what happened with this 45 car and Tyler Reddick. He hits the box entering on pit road in his green flag stop at Richmond when he had a chance to go on and win that race. And then he I'm not saying he gifted it to Buescher, but he gave away the lead.
The guy could arguably have 3 or 4 more wins. And we talk about it all the time with Christopher Bell and Denny Hamlin, but the 45 has shown just as much speed.
And he did the same shit last week. He did the same thing. He would have been leading. It would have been Buescher chasing him, Truex chasing Buescher. So when you look at current form, I think it's really easy to say, hey, Martin Truex Jr. has been really fast. Look at what he did last week. It's like, yeah, Tyler Reddick has thrown away both of those last races. So I think that they're really neck and neck. I don't think I'd give the edge to Truex. If you only have access to that 4.5-1, I would say wait on that and maybe go with Tyler Reddick. But it's going to be a great race. Hopefully, both of them unload well and qualify up front. If they do, they're going to eat up a large portion of that favorite market, leaving, they still have to run the race. So there's other guys out there that have a lot of speed. Now, when it comes to Chase Elliott, I just don't think he has the speed in his car. Like, do your eyeballs when you're watching, does it say?
No, I'm never blown away by what speed he has. I keep looking when he qualifies like crap, and I think he's going to find a way to be able to pick through the field and be the bane of my existence when I don't have any exposure. Unfortunately, unlike last year, when he had bad cars that somehow gave him good finishes. This year, I feel like, oh, he's undervalued in a top 10 market, like we saw with one of our best bets and some of the other stuff that's out there. And then he goes out there and does something stupid. So Chase Elliott right now will not be getting any holiday greeting cards from me. But at the same time, it doesn't mean I'm writing him off for dead, given everything that's gone on, knowing that he has to win and get in.
Yeah, the win to get in thing, I think only he's going to have to do it on strategy. We just haven't seen that same speed out of that 9 car, not only on road courses, but just on ovals as well. They're a tick behind the 24 and the 5, and they're going to have to do something desperate. If you do think Chase Elliott's good, I would say take that outright price. Don't take him in matchups, because they're going to have to do something different in order to win this race. I don't see him pulling it and going out there and leading a bunch of laps. If so, I would love to see them tear that car apart in R&D, because I just don't see that happening.
You know they're not going to tear apart the 9 car if it ends up in victory lane, regardless of how trimmed out it is or what kind of tape that they have underneath the wrap or anything else to give them a competitive advantage. The 9 car will not come under any scrutiny if NASCAR has anything to say about it. If we move into the second bucket of drivers, it is the Kyle and Kyle show, and we'll put Chris Bell in there as well, given the respect he's being shown in the market. Kyle Larson, 10-1, 12-1 thereabouts. Kyle Busch and Christopher Bell the same way. When we look at Kyle Larson, I mean, I can joke about it, but last week was arguably the quietest 5th place finish we've seen from the 5 car. Never once did I think he could win the race. I look at the results at the end, not having any matchups on or against him, go, holy shit, I had no idea this guy had a top 5 car.
Yep.
It was the only HMS driver still running at the end of the race, so he was good in that regard. A pair of top 5s over his last 5 races. The problem for him is just 48% of his races so far this year has allowed him to finish inside the top 10. It's a far cry from Martin Truex, who is seemingly inside the top 10 every week since they figured it out. When you look at road course history, Larson, a 3rd place finish here back in 2021. Both road course races this year, he's finished outside the top 10. Kyle Busch, though, had a stretch of 7 straight top 10 finishes earlier this year. The last 4 races have been a completely mixed bag. 36 at New Hampshire, 21st Pocono, 3rd at Richmond, 37th at Michigan. Road course history so far this season, been the most consistent at the 2 tracks that you've highlighted, finished 2nd at COTA and 2nd at Sonoma. And Christopher Bell, he has been the model of inconsistency. You talk about self-destructing and self-inflicted wounds. He has been the poster child for said experience. Kyle Larson, Kyle Busch, Christopher Bell. Buy, sell, hold.
The only guy I would be interested in buying is that Kyle Busch at 12-1. Remember, that's the same car that went out there and dominated this race last year. And although I do think that Reddick is maybe a little bit more complete road course racer, we're still talking about Kyle Busch here. And this guy, I do think if you're going to get involved with any of the guys, it is him. The only, I guess, downside is we just haven't seen the same speed out of the 8 car on road courses as we did last year with Reddick running it. And I think that kind of, to my point, is he's probably properly priced. However, he could go out there and qualify well and run a good race. So he's just been a little inconsistent. And man, I just feel like whenever he has an issue, he just quits. Like if Kyle Busch blows a tire and nicks the wall, he just says it's killed and drives to the garage. So it doesn't really help my season futures. I just feel like he could have gone out there and done well, or at least kept running the race like Chris Bell did last week. So I do think Kyle Busch can be good. And I guess I'll just transition myself right into Chris Bell, who
I mean, you don't need a host for this. You don't need a host for this. I introduced the topic. Go ahead and I can go grab a cocktail in the interim.
He's just snake bit. I mean, I don't know what to do about this 12 team. They just keep making mistakes.
The 20 team.
Maybe, yeah, the 12. He's 12-1. Yeah, the 20 team. He's 12-1. He got up to like 16-1 kind of earlier in the week as we saw the Truex and Reddick kind of get bet down. And then some money came in on Chris Bell. Now he's sitting around that 12-1. I also think that's probably a pretty fair price for him. You know, he hasn't been kind of this road course ringer that like some of the other guys that that would throw Truex and Reddick in there. You know, he was able to win at the Roval last year, but that was a more of a strategy call. He was able to take tires, get a couple cautions, and work his way to the front and cement himself in the Final Four. So I'm not that high on Chris Bell. Now, he did run pretty well here last year. He also had a good qualifying, which I think will be really, really important. But at this point, I don't see his odds dropping too much, like I said, with the guys that I think will qualify well.
Yeah, I mean, look, I was as surprised as anybody, and we had a piece of Chris Bell that he went off as the favorite last weekend in Michigan, had a fast car in practice,
Oh yeah.
just couldn't live up to some of those expectations. And if the number were to drop too far, regardless of how he unloads, I'm not sure I'd want much exposure, if any, for the 20 car, given some of the inconsistency we've seen. He may have been the fastest car at the end of the race last week, but it doesn't matter when you're not really in contention. You're on the tail end of the lead lap. And yeah, finishing 14th, credit to him. He battled all day long. And I'm thinking in the back of their head, somewhere along the way, I'm sure the 20 team went, I should have just wrecked the damn car. We could have spent Monday at home and started prepping for Indy instead of going back to Michigan.
Well, and the other thing too is if you're going to bet Bell, it's really hard to do it in matchups these days because he's a heavy favorite and he's making mistakes. So if you are interested in Bell, I would take more of the outright or make sure you're getting paid, whether it's a group bet or even a top 3 or top 5. But right now he's kind of a no bet in matchups. I think he's overpriced for the actual finishes that his team is getting. He's properly priced for the car he has, but not properly priced for the finishes. And someone that's kind of opposite of that has been Larson. Larson hasn't had great cars, but just kind of sneaky getting these finishes. So, I don't like Larson from the outright perspective, but I think that this team has kind of settled in and said, hey, we're going to have to grind out some of these, maybe 6th, 7th, 8th place finishes, which we're not used to seeing Kyle Larson, kind of happy with that particular finish. But right now they haven't had the same speed. They're getting the finishes. And I think that they're set up for a run in the playoffs because if Kyle Larson doesn't make mistakes, there's going to be certain tracks in the playoffs where he's going to be a rocket. And if he can take advantage of those, I expect to see him in the Final Four. But that being said, he has to stay super consistent with these, 4 of his last 5 races he's finished. Let's see, 6th, 5th. Oh, excuse me. I was looking at the wrong guy. Wow, Brad Keselowski, by the way, has had some good finishes.
I was going to say, when you look at the 5 and the 6 side by side, you almost feel like the numbers have been transposed depending on how you lay them out.
If you just look at like the last 10 or so races, ever since Gateway, Kyle Larson's just been very consistent. 4th, 8th, 5th, 4th. Then he had the DNF in Atlanta, comes back to New Hampshire's 3rd, has some issues with Kyle Larson at Pocono. And Richmond, he also had. I think Richmond was only his really bad race. Otherwise, you could probably throw in a top 5 finish at Pocono, and you really only have 1 or 2 bad races out of the last 10 for Kyle Larson. So I think he's going to be good matchups. I don't like his outright price though.
He's kind of become Kevin Harvick light. The market doesn't truly respect him when he doesn't have a race-winning car, but as a result, you're able to extract a little bit more betting value from some of the opportunities that exist out there. And if it feels like we spent a short period of time running through some of the household names, it's so we could give you about 15 minutes to talk about the guy that you always like to expound on every time we go to a road course, and he continues to let you down. That being the 16 of AJ Allmendinger, who right now is priced right around 18-1, and it is one of the longest prices that we've seen on the 16 pre-week at a road course in recent memory. When we look at his current form, 4 straight finishes, a 17th or worse. Going to need a win to get into the playoffs. He's going to have 2 great opportunities this weekend in Indy and next weekend at Watkins Glen. There's no points path for him at this juncture. He's clearly a guy that feels comfortable in Indianapolis. He's an Indianapolis 500 veteran, ran that race, won the inaugural Cup race on the IMS road course in 2021, backed that up with a 7th place finish last year in the Wreckfest, was 34th at COTA this season, 6th at Sonoma. AJ Allmendinger, Wormser, how are you handling?
Yeah, I like his outright price. The thing at that 34th at COTA, I mean, he did the same thing at 2021 at COTA where he, was racing for the win off the final turn. And then the next thing you know, he's stuck in the gravel and getting a 30th place finish. So he is kind of a checkers or wreckers, especially this week. He needs to win to get in the playoffs. I do like his chances more here than I do Watkins Glen. I don't think he's had some of the same speed or the kind of the high speed road course stuff that you're going to need at Watkins Glen. But he's 18. I can't believe he's 18-1. I mean, this is a great price and a guy that always contends. And I was about ready to give out a best bet on him until I checked the price. That's changed drastically since in the last 45 minutes. So
which particular market?
The top 10.
Oh, okay.
He was minus 118. Now he's minus 210.
All right. Well, minus 210, I'd have more comfort in trying to take the no price against that.
Yeah.
And for those listeners who are tuning in, whether you're listening Thursday or Friday, we're recording this on Wednesday evening like we always do, just to kind of get perspective. in terms of an overall timestamp. But yeah, that's one hell of a move, going from minus $1.18 out to minus 210 in a top 10 market that, quite honestly, is as unpredictable, with so many drivers with long shot odds that can factor into the equation and be very relevant this week.
Yeah, I totally agree. So listen, I like Dinger at 18-1. He's just not a guy that I like to take in matchups. You know, he kind of fits into that Chris Bell thing. Like, if he's going to be good, he's going to be racing for the win. I'd rather have that price. And by the way, he might wreck himself trying to win. So whenever that happens, that's just Dinger. He's a bit of a spaz out there on those road courses. You know, he could be leading the Xfinity race by 5 or 6 seconds, and he'll still be bitching about his car. It's like, you have a 5-second lead, okay?
I mean, this is Kyle Busch. That's what Kyle Busch does, and we talk about Kyle Busch as one of the most talented drivers in the sport.
Yep. Yeah, he's the Kyle Busch of road course racing. If he's running third with running down the leaders, he's still going to find a reason to bitch about how tight his car is. And but I like Dinger. I always like to see him in road courses. He's just, if there's a guy you need to drive through the field, he's the guy that could do it. So, you know, if you're interested in Dinger, I don't hate that 18-1 price at all.
We have seen him against some high-profile drivers in head-to-head matchups. He's taken a little bit of money. I believe Caesars had the price. Actually opened as an underdog against SVG. Now right around a pick'em. So you're talking about even money to minus 115 both ways. So it's going to be interesting to see how some of these matchups do indeed get priced, with a lot of drivers that are capable, but a lot of drivers that may have different philosophies going into the weekend. And that's the last thing before we officially wave the checkered flag for stage 3 here. You know, when you're handicapping Indy this weekend, are there certain drivers that you've identified? And you don't have to give them all away, because the last thing we need to do, other than if we're using it as a best bet, and the justification there is tip our hand in how we want to bet on or against some of these guys. But there have to be drivers you've identified that we think are going to race for points. I mean, there are a couple of drivers that come to mind for me, one of which is in the Toyota camp that'll remain nameless, because he's in a position now where he can still point his way into the field unless we have 2 new winners in the next 3 races.
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand the playoff scenario for every driver. If the driver needs to win, maybe shy away from the matchups, right? Because they're gonna end up on some sort of strategy where they might need a caution, and if the caution falls, it's perfect for them. If the caution doesn't fall, then they're gonna run out of fuel and they're gonna finish, you know, or they're going to have to pit and barely finish on the lead lap. So I think make sure just the last little check before you fire on a bet, just double check and make sure that someone's not in a must-win scenario. And then on that same token, if there's guys that just need to point their way in, and there are a few of them out there that can do it, I think that those are the guys you like to trust. And they are more likely to have a better finish than their average running position, because they're going to play it pretty conservative throughout the day and then maybe force it a little bit at the end if they feel comfortable with their car. So that would be the thought process going in. And then obviously, you know, we'll have more information next week when we go to Watkins Glen. And then we also will play the lottery at Daytona and which I think is just a phenomenal way to end the regular season. It's like, hey, by the way,
it should be the final race for the regular season every single season, because if you're sitting on that 16 line and you're hoping to point your way in, you don't know you're safe until that race is officially over.
I mean, look at last year. Truex didn't get in because Austin Dillon won the race. Hey, we're going to have this whole season. And then, by the way, to get into the playoffs, we're just going to run the lottery. Like, literally, we're going to pull a name out of a hat. And it's not quite like that, but it's pretty damn close, because anybody can win there. And it actually makes for the most entertaining super speedway race of the year, in my opinion.
And it wasn't even just Austin Dillon winning it. It was Truex finishing like 8th with a car that was probably something that you could pick up at the impound lot for $37. And then Ryan Blaney, 107 laps down, that somehow was able to gain extra points as a result. So there is no doubt that Daytona is must-see TV. It's a couple weeks away. We'll get there eventually. But you, my friend, have done a tremendous job. We'll head towards victory lane here with the full breakdown of stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. You can follow Chris on Twitter at ChrisWerme15. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And Wormser, it's time for us to get off the schneid with a best bet winner. Where are you taking us in the pre-week portion of the program?
You want to do Hamlin or do you want to go with McDowell? You tell me.
You're really going to make me bet McDriver in some capacity.
Well, here's why.
Look, you can. There's no rules that say you have to pick one. If you feel comfortable with both, then you want to go a partial position on each. You know, you
I
have
like
that
both of those
luxury.
guys to finish in the top 10. I do. I like both of them. You know, I think Denny's.
Give an action to the listeners.
I fired a lot more this week at this point in the week at this point than I typically do. So I don't know why that is, or just the odds, or I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that Michael McDowell
getting to your head.
I think Michael McDowell at plus 105 for a top 10 is a really good price. I think him and Chris Buescher are almost the same on road courses, and Chris Buescher is minus 200. So I don't know what the odds makers are looking at, or they're probably just reacting to bets, I would imagine.
Ironic coming from the man who earlier says, you know, if there's a guy that's in a must-win situation, I'd rather bet them to win than tie them up in matchups in some of the other markets. All right, Michael McDowell it is for a top 10 finish.
Is he in a must-win?
Yeah, he's got to win to get in. He can't point his way in at this point, at least in my opinion.
Why do I not think that?
I mean,
if that's the case, then I like Denny. Let's figure this out.
Here's the thing that makes great podcasting. We're going to let you pull up the standings, and we're going to let you look at it, because that's what every listener wants, is you scrolling
I'm going to do it.
Not having officially done your homework.
Yeah.
So
I hate it when you're right.
You're going to pull that up. And I mean, I'm only right every so often, but you know, when you talk about Denny Hamlin, and I'll filibuster a little bit, we mentioned him earlier in the show, and we've seen his odds open as low as 20, did drift out to 25 and came back down. And when you're looking at the 11 season in a nutshell, I mean, he's now has 4 consecutive top 7 finishes on the year. He was incredibly fast entering Chicago, was at the pole, Sonoma in the pole, obviously shot himself in the foot a little bit. It's obviously yet to translate into necessarily great finish at the road courses, but the speed is there. So if you're betting on a guy that has a race winning car, I can understand why you're intrigued, especially at his price for a top 10, you know, coming into the weekend.
Yeah, I think he has a chance to win the race. And by the way, do you want to send an apology letter? Do you want my home address, or do you want my work address? They're pretty similar.
I was going to say, I'm pretty sure they're the same. 3
points to the good.
Yeah.
Ty Gibbs is 3 points to the good, and Michael McDowell is 3 points to the bad. So
that's
it's
fair.
just that 16th spot. Now, where you would be right is if we somehow end up with another winner. Okay, then Bubba's kind of in.
Right here. I'm not going to officially concede to you, so we're going to go technically we're both right, because if McDowell is banking on there not being a new winner to keep him in the mix, I think that's a dangerous game to play over the next 2 weeks if he has a car capable of winning the race. But at the same time, there is a path for him to point in. So, all right,
absolutely point in. He's got 2 road course races, but you know, he does have. I would say Suarez, McDowell, and Gibbs are kind of the 3 guys that are going for that. AJ Allmendinger's 24 points back. He'd have to have a miraculous kind of run of points, and he'd probably need to get lucky as well. Whereas I think if Michael McDowell goes out there and scores 15 stage points, you know, I think and finishes in the top 5, I think he'll be sitting really, really good heading into Watkins Glen. So I still am going to stick with Michael McDowell top 10. Like I said, I don't like the win price on him because he does not need to win. And I do like the top 10.
All right. A pair of best bet winners for you. I'm glad we were able to go through that exercise. Listeners now have wasted 3 to 4 minutes of their life that they're not going to be able to get back.
Everybody.
But that's why we know that Bet the Board listeners are the best in the business. They want to get smarter. They want to poke fun at us. And for those folks who enjoyed this fine comedy hour, please tweet at us. Let us hear about it. So, all right, buddy, we're going road course racing at Indy. The goal is to avoid Calamity Corner in turn 1 and hope that this thing stays green from start to finish for us. We're able to cash some tickets, maybe bring home a long shot, or at least keep some long shots in contention with some of the pre-week exposure that we tipped our hand on here. So for Chris Werme, I'm Todd Fuhrman. I can't even talk, and I'm bookending the show the same way I started. Not just one best bet, but with 2 best bet tickets in hand. Hopefully we'll see you at the window.